All right, so let's dive into this. What purpose did temples serve in ancient Egypt?
Ancient Egyptian temples are so interesting. It's so fascinating. And if you ever have the chance to go to Egypt and tour some of these temples, I highly recommend it. It will blow your mind to see the parallels between ancient Egyptian temples and our modern temples today. Obviously, there are some differences. And I think there's a reason why we see a lot of parallels and a lot of similarities. And that's because if you look at Abraham chapter 1, it talks about when the first Pharaoh was setting up the kingdom of Egypt. And it says in verse 26, Pharaoh, being a righteous man, established his kingdom and judged his people wisely and justly all his days, seeking earnestly to imitate that order established by the fathers in their first generations. So it's saying that Pharaoh was establishing his kingdom on the patterns he knew from the fathers, referencing all the way back, to Noah and Adam. That's the pattern he's using as those ancient covenants. Now it says he didn't have right to the priesthood, and we won't go into all the reasons for that right now, but he recognized that the order and the rights that were established anciently were the foundation, and that's what he wanted as the foundation for his kingdom. Those rights became the method that they used to crown new pharaohs. So their temples became a place for coronation ceremonies, and they ritually enacted this passage of the king from, just being a mere mortal king. If you go to a temple like the Temple of Karnak, it's super interesting because you see this procession that the king would go through as he became the next pharaoh. There was a process of crossing a body of water. You almost think of that as like baptism or rebirth, or, water is often in ancient Egypt equated with chaos, the waters of chaos. And so you're moving from chaos to order. At the Temple of Karnak, there's literally a garden room where you have these huge pillars that look like trees. And so you go through this garden kind of state. And ultimately, the Pharaoh would come to the door of the Holy of Holies. So there, inscribed into the stone, are things that would be really familiar to those who've been through LDS temples. It shows how the king would be washed and anointed and given new robes. And then you actually have what they call the ritual embrace right there at the door of the Holy of Holies, where God reaches through to the king, and the king reaches through, and they have this ritual embrace, the sacred embrace, where the king is given all of these blessings. And you see the blessings written in hieroglyphics right there. And they sound really familiar, those of us who've been through LDS temples. There are some really striking parallels in these ancient Egyptian temples.
That's really amazing to me. So it gives me a sense that even though we have records of what the tabernacle and the temples were for the ancient Jews, obviously there was something that existed previous to that, previous to this Pharaoh. Now, just a question I have just to kind of put things in chronological order or something. So, in my mind, I can envision 4,000 years ago-ish, the pyramids were built, these great pyramids. Was Abraham after that time and when this righteous Pharaoh ruled?
Yes, this is right after the time of Noah. So they might have been somewhat contemporaneous. I'd have to go back and look at the details on that and the estimates of when each of them lived. But yeah, Pharaoh was setting up his kingdom not long after the flood, the first kingdom of Egypt. And Abraham wasn't long after that either. And I say not long. I mean, we have to remember that back in these days, you're talking about people who lived well over 100 years. Sometimes, Adam was over 900 years. So when it says there in the book of Abraham that Pharaoh was seeking earnestly to imitate that order established by the fathers, clearly there it's indicating that this was an ancient order going all the way back to Adam, all the way back to the beginning. And that's what he was trying to imitate as he set up his kingdom. And so I think that same understanding of the need for covenants, the need for transformation, and the desire to re-enter the presence of the Lord, those elements and others have been there from the beginning. And so we see echoes of them down through the ages. We see echoes of that in ancient Egypt. We see echoes of that in the ancient tabernacle. And then I believe we have a restart today in modern temples.
So the symbolism that you talked about in Karnak and whatnot, how long throughout history did those things continue, or was it just a short period of time?
I can't give you a number of years, but it's all over Egypt. And so all of those ancient Egyptian dynasties certainly had elements of that ancient covenant. Now, was it a legitimate covenant? Did they have all of the I's dotted and T's crossed? Probably not. Was it, it changed over time. And so different pharaohs would make adjustments as they saw fit. Certainly the Egyptian theology evolved, right? And it's interesting too to look at how, you have the ancient Israelites and the ancient Egyptians who both receive a more ancient covenant, and then they morph it to kind of fit their culture and their theology. And so with the ancient Egyptians, it becomes this whole pantheon of gods that they start to worship. And so they really open it up, whereas the ancient Israelites kind of flatten it. They become very ardently monotheistic. But even though their theology changes and evolves, you still see the echoes of that more ancient covenant that they received from the ancient patriarchs.
Another curiosity that I have, this is just so interesting, is I'm curious if there's any signs of like animal sacrifice even early on. And, we read in the book of Abraham where there was actually human sacrifice at some point. Maybe that was when Abraham was young and a child. Anyway, I wonder if you have any more insights on that.
There were sacrifices offered, and in the ancient Egyptian temples, the priests who worked in those temples, some of their main responsibilities were to leave offerings for the gods, and they often had statues for their various gods in there, and they would leave an offering. So in a sense, that's a sacrifice. As far as ritual animal sacrifice, I don't believe it was to the extent that the Israelites had. For a long time, though, I think in the academic world, the understanding has been that the Egyptians did not offer human sacrifice. But recently, and so that was kind of a hit against the Book of Abraham. But recently, they have discovered that there does appear to be some convincing evidence that the Egyptians were on occasion offering human sacrifice, much in the way the Book of Abraham describes it.
So yeah, very interesting that we see some similarities, but we see some like bad influences that have worked their way in as well.
Yeah, and I mean, it's understandable, right? You're talking about fallen human beings who don't always have all of the information, doing the best that they can. I don't doubt that various pharaohs along the way wanted to use this to kind of consolidate their political power. Certainly the same was true in the Israelite kingdoms, where various kings, I think you see this in the Josiah reforms with King Josiah and King Hezekiah. They start to change some of the beliefs and some of the theology to really enhance the power, the political power of the temple, and saying you can't worship anywhere else except for in the central temple in Jerusalem, which was a change. Before that, they had worship centers around Israel. So certainly people have different agendas that they bring. It's morphed to fit various cultures and different understandings, and everyone's trying to figure out what we do with this. But it's still, even with all of that, you can still see the remnants of that ancient covenant, and it's still there. And that ancient covenant that God made with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, that he would provide a savior for them, and that if they would stay true and faithful to that they could be restored to the presence of God someday. Those themes are still there.
So, and just for my understanding and the viewers, when we're talking about these temples in Egypt, we're not talking about the pyramids or other tombs. Is that correct?
Correct. Of course, the pyramids at Giza are world famous. Those appear to have been tombs. I know there's some debate about that. But what I'm talking about are the ritual temples that are still standing today in Egypt. You can go and visit them and tour through them. They're remarkable. But you'll see that I think the temple at Karnak is a really good example. There's also the temple at Luxor. And so they weren't tombs. They weren't pyramids. They were these huge temple complexes, really quite large. And the construction of them is just every bit as stunning as the pyramids were. But yeah, they're separate from tombs and separate from pyramids.
I've recently seen archaeology of what they're calling like Melchizedek's temple in like the city of David or something. Do you know much about, are there similarities between that and what you've seen in Egypt?
I don't know that there's so many similarities with that. In Egypt, there are some interesting markings coming out of that City of David temple. There's a lot of debate about exactly what it is, and it's really interesting to watch the archaeology on that. I think the patterns that we see in both the ancient Israelite and the Egyptian temples are really interesting, where there's a processional, like a ritual processional. You're often crossing water. There's some sort of body of water that's crossed. You go through, there are trees involved, whether it's the lampstand that's in the form of a tree or the hypostyle hall in the Egyptian temple. You're passing through this garden state, and ultimately you end up in the presence of the Lord. So the temples all follow that same basic pattern.
Very cool. Well, I appreciate be willing to share some of your studies with us. And we've got plans. We're coming back for one more episode. We're going to be talking about what covenants we make in the temple. So be sure to subscribe and stay tuned for that episode.